Boys and girls, this is Benjamin Bok Choi. Welcome you all back to another F1 Driver Deep Dive. The subject of today is the Mexican Minister of Defense himself, Sergio Perez. The reason we are looking at him today is a result of the 2022 Brazilian Grand Prix, where Perez's teammate Max Verstappen adamantly refused to let him by after Perez had let Verstappen by earlier in the race. For the uninformed, this was quite important for Perez as he was in a close fight for P2 in the standings with Ferrari driver Charles Leclerc. With only 2 races left, every single point counted. Along with comments proclaiming Verstappen to be a selfish driver, which we won't comment on today, there were other comments claiming Perez was the only reason Verstappen even won the 2021 F1 Drivers' Championship, a sentiment that seemed to follow any Red Bull or Sergio Perez video ever since the incident. Since these comments were so rampant, and I'm curious like a kitty, I decided I'd take a look back at the entirety of the 2021 season to see how much of a role Perez did play in Verstappen winning the driver's title. Note, this isn't a video debating how good or bad of a driver Sergio Perez is, nor is it about whether or not he deserves the Red Bull seat, as those are cans of worms we do not want to open. This is solely to investigate the claim that Verstappen never would have won the championship without the help of Perez. So with that out of the way, let's do a race-by-race breakdown of Perez's 2021 season. The season did not start off well for Perez at Bahrain as he didn't even get into Q3. What made matters worse was the engine malfunction on the formation lap that sent him to the pit lane for the start of the race. Though not his fault, he now had to charge through the field to try and recover his race day. Although he did show really good pace, he only managed to move up to P5 and finished 52 seconds behind the leaders, having no effect on the race or championship battle whatsoever. A bit unlucky, but he didn't do himself any favors in qualifying either. In fact, the engine issue probably helped make people forget how poorly he qualified in his Red Bull debut. At Imola, Perez managed to qualify in P2 and 1 spot ahead of his teammate after Verstappen had a moment in his final qualifying run. But this would be as good as it gets. Perez was swamped as the race started and found himself in P4 by the time Nicholas Latifi brought out the safety car after driving into Haas driver Nikita Mazepin. And his woes did not end there. Behind the safety car, Perez went off, was passed by Lando Norris and Pierre Gasly, and then hit with a 10-second penalty after coming back on the track and re-overtaking Norris and Gasly under safety car. By the time the Russell Bottas safety car came in, Perez found himself in 4th, though he would not stay there long. On lap 38, Perez went off again, going into the first few corners and dropped all the way down to P12. Ultimately finished in 11th, but in a race where Hamilton went off and dropped to the midfield pack, a podium finish would have taken away vital points from the Mercedes driver. Instead, Hamilton finished on the podium and Perez finished outside of the points, 67 seconds behind his teammate. Perez qualified a respectable 4th behind his teammate on a weekend where the Red Bull was clearly outpaced by the Mercedes in Portugal. But while Verstappen was stuck in it, fighting with the 2 Mercedes cars, Perez spent a good chunk of the first part of the race fighting with Ferraris and McLarens for P4, where he would finish the race. Perez finished 10 seconds behind his teammate, even though Max pitted 4 times in the race to Perez's 3. Although close enough to threaten Hamilton for a few laps, Perez was on older tires and never a true threat. Another weekend, another race where he had little effect on the outcome or the championship fight. Spain started off poorly for Perez as he only managed a P8 on Saturday qualifying, meaning he would be starting the race on the back foot once again in the early part of the season. The race was rather unimpressive as well, as Perez only managed to make up 3 positions before finishing the race in 5th and 48 seconds behind his teammate, once again having no effect on the race or championship battle. After an unimpressive 5 races in a row, Monaco did not begin any better, though this time it wasn't entirely his fault. After Leclerc crashed into a wall at the end of his final Q3 run, the qualifying session was red flagged and no one was allowed to finish their laps. Perez was only sitting in 9th at the time, so that was where he qualified. He had some better luck on race day though, as Leclerc was unable to start the race due to damage on the car from the previous day's trip to see Barry R. Bottas ran into issues with the wheel cap during his pit stop, so his day ended early as well. With Hamilton pitting earlier and stuck behind slower traffic, Red Bull's strategy had Perez go long on his first stint, allowing him to merge from his pit stop in P4. He still only finished 4th and 21 seconds behind his teammate, who won the race, but a solid first stint along with some luck and a good strategy call allowed him to steal some valuable points from Lewis Hamilton. Some bad luck and some good luck, but what he could control, Perez did a good enough job. So after 6 races, Perez finally had an effect on the championship battle. Like Monaco, Q3 at Azerbaijan ended early when AlphaTauri driver Yuki Tsunoda went into a wall during everyone's final Q3 run. And like Monaco, Perez did not put in a good first run in Q3, so he would start the race in P7. The race started well for Perez, moving up to P5 before the field hit turn 3 and then eventually found himself in P4 right behind his teammate a lap later. By lap 8, Perez was up to 3rd and only a few seconds behind Verstappen. After another good strategy call from Red Bull and a slow pit stop from Mercedes, Perez found himself in P2. After Verstappen's unlucky tire failure, Perez would find himself leading the race. When the race started again, it seemed Hamilton got the jump on Perez, but a mistake with his brake bias settings saw Hamilton go straight on in turn 1. Perez would have the best race of his season so far and emerged victorious. This was the first time that Perez factored into the championship battle on merit since the season began. He was close enough to his teammate and Hamilton to where Mercedes had to account for him in their race strategy. After an amazing race day at Baku, Perez started off the French Grand Prix only managing to qualify 4th while his teammate qualified on pole. By lap 17, Perez was almost 17 seconds off of his teammate and 20 seconds off Hamilton in the lead. Although he would eventually overtake Bottas and finish on the podium, he would finish almost 12 seconds off Verstappen, who stopped twice for tires, to Perez's once. A good race overall for Perez, but again never really close enough to Hamilton or Verstappen to have any effect. In the first of 2 races at Austria, Perez put in another disappointing qualifying on Saturday. While Verstappen qualified on pole, Perez only managed a P5, being beaten by Lando Norris in the McLaren. Due to a grid penalty to Bottas from an incident on Friday practice, Perez would start the race in P4. On lap 10, Perez finally made it by Norris, but by this point was 13 seconds off race leader and teammate Verstappen. A slow pit stop dropped him to P5 after Mercedes jumped on the mistake and pitted Bottas soon after to overtake. Perez stopped for tires once again later in the race to take the fastest lap, but Hamilton stole that point on the last lap after his second pit stop. Although Perez drove well enough to almost overtake Bottas on the last lap, he would finish 4th and 48 seconds behind his teammate, once again never getting close enough to either Hamilton or Verstappen to really matter. In the second of the 2 Austria races, Perez finally qualified ahead of Hamilton, though he was still beaten by Norris and started P3 on race day. While battling with Norris on lap 4 after a safety car restart, Perez was pushed out wide in turn 4 during an overly optimistic overtake attempt and ended up driving through the gravel trap. Norris would receive a 5-second penalty, but this would bring no relief to Perez as he would drop to P10. Perez would pick up his own 5-second penalty after ushering Leclerc off the track at a similar spot on track, and another 5-second penalty after a second clash with Leclerc a few laps later. At the end of it all, Perez finished P6, 58 seconds off teammate and race winner Max Verstappen. He was too far away to have any effect, and one could argue actually helped Hamilton by awarding him one position from his overly aggressive driving during the race. Perez had a lap deleted in qualifying at the British Grand Prix and ended up starting the sprint race in P5. Right away, Perez started dropping, falling as low as P8 before passing Ricciardo at Stowe on the first lap. On lap 5, he went off after Maggots and Beckett's and dropped all the way down to P19 after having to pit for damage. On the final lap, he was overtaken by Mazepin and finished the sprint race in last place. On race day, Perez only made it up to P10 with a few laps to go, but Red Bull pitted him onto new tires to take the fastest lap. With Verstappen DNFing early in the race and Hamilton at the front of the grid, Perez once again had no effect on the race or championship battle, but he did take 1 point away from Hamilton. Perez was once again beaten by his teammate after he failed to make it to the start line before the qualifying clock ran out at Hungary qualifying. As such, he would start P4 in the race on Sunday. After a mistake from Bottas at race start, Perez along with 4 other drivers would see their race end before it began. Not his fault, but still did not factor into the championship battle. At a rain-soaked Belgian Grand Prix, Perez only managed to qualify in P7, beaten by midfield cars and George Russell in a Williams. Race start was attempted a few times on Sunday but never really got going. Points were awarded for qualifying positions after 2 laps under the safety car. Obviously, he couldn't do anything about the weather on Sunday, but his poor qualifying in the wet saw him not take any points away from Lewis Hamilton, who qualified and finished in P3. Perez put in a poor banker lap at the Dutch Grand Prix and then ran into traffic for his final run in Q1. He was eliminated in Q1 while his teammate qualified on pole for his home Grand Prix. He managed to finish the race in 8th, but a poor qualifying never really gave him a chance. The only time he was close to his teammate was when Max lapped him during the race. Once again, was nowhere near the leaders and not a factor in the race or championship battle. Perez just barely managed to avoid being kicked out of qualifying in Q2, finishing 10th in the session. Q3 did not go much better. While Verstappen qualified 3rd, Perez only managed a P9 for the sprint race. By the time Gasly's safety car came in, Perez was down to 10th. Perez overtook Stroll after a scruffy turn 1, but was made to hand it back. Eventually, Perez would make it up to P9 after a cleaner overtake on Stroll. While Verstappen finished the sprint race in 2nd, Perez finished where he started in 9th, and 29 seconds back. After Hamilton and Verstappen crashed each other out on Sunday, Perez eventually fought his way up to P3 behind the two McLarens. Perez would finish in P3, but a 5-second penalty incurred from overtaking Leclerc off track and not handing the position back would see him officially finish a few spots lower. Again, another good recovery race, but as Hamilton and Verstappen both crashed out early on, had no effect on the championship fight. Qualifying in Russia saw many drivers setting their Q3 laps on a drying track with inters. In the dying moments of Q3, some drivers threw on dry tires to set the fastest laps of the day, while Perez only managed to qualify P9. However, he started the race in P8 after Valtteri Bottas received a grid penalty following some engine component changes. Perez made it as high as P4 by lap 47 when the rain started to fall. On lap 49, his team asked if he wanted to change onto inters, but Perez decided to stay on the dry compounds. It wasn't until lap 51, after going off twice at the same corner, did he finally decide to come in, but by then it was too late. He was passed by Verstappen before pitting, and by the time he came out on the inters, he would fall to P9, where he would finish the race 37 seconds behind his teammate who started from the pit lane. Another weekend in a row where qualifying was done on a drying track, though not nearly as wet as Russia when it began, and another disappointing qualifying for Perez, managing only P7, though he would start P6 after Hamilton changed components on his car. The race would start on inters, with Perez moving up to P4 early on. Although leading Hamilton by as much as 9 seconds at one point, was eventually overtaken by Hamilton after stopping to pit on lap 38. Perez did well enough to keep Hamilton behind for a few laps and had a strong enough undercut to come out in front of him after Hamilton stopped late in the race. Finished P3 and 19 seconds off Verstappen, but this was probably the first time all season where Perez actually played a role in holding Hamilton back and helping his teammate in the championship fight. Perez qualified P3, but behind both Verstappen and Hamilton at the US Grand Prix. He managed to stay close to the leaders early in the race, but by the time of the first pit stops, had fallen behind the two leaders. Ultimately finished 42 seconds behind teammate and race winner Max Verstappen, but had very little effect on the race and championship fight. Perez qualified 4th in his home race in Mexico behind his teammate in 3rd. Contact to Bottas in turn 1 allowed Perez to move up to 3rd before his safety car brought an end to green flag racing. After their first pit stops, he was able to stay close enough to not allow Hamilton a second to breathe and finish just a second behind Hamilton. With Hamilton not able to get close enough to Norris to give Norris blue flags, and with Perez breathing down his neck, this was the second time this season where Perez directly was a factor in the championship race. Hamilton couldn't get aggressive with closing in on Norris, as Perez would have jumped on any mistake, nor could he afford to waste tires, as he would need them later in the race with Perez so close behind. A good race from Perez that saw him finish just 18 seconds behind Verstappen, one of the closest he's ever been to his teammate, though Max most likely stopped pushing early on when it seemed Hamilton was never going to catch up. After arguably his best race all year, Perez only qualified 4th for the Brazilian Grand Prix sprint race. With Hamilton sent to the back of the grid after a rear wing discrepancy disqualified him from qualifying, Perez started 3rd but was quickly dispatched by Sainz at the start of the race, a move that Perez wouldn't recover from during the sprint race. On race day, however, Perez managed to take 3rd after Sainz and Norris made contact at race start. He would find himself in 2nd by lap 3, but was quickly caught up to and overtaken by Lewis Hamilton on lap 19. Bottas pitting under a VSC saw Perez back down to P4 about halfway through the race. Perez pitted 5 times during the race, with his final time coming 3 laps before the end of the race, taking the fastest lap point. With one more extra pit stop, Perez finished 29 seconds behind his teammate, and although able to hold Hamilton off for 2 or 3 laps, it ultimately did very little as Hamilton managed to pass both Red Bulls and take home the victory. For the 3rd time in 2021, Perez did not make it into Q3, only managing to finish Q2 in 11th. With Hamilton leading from the race start, Perez was just too far back to do anything. He did well enough to make it up to P4, but missed the podium by just about 3 seconds. Even with Verstappen pitting one more time than Perez did, Perez still finished 37 seconds behind his teammate and 62 seconds behind race winner Lewis Hamilton. While Verstappen was 1 corner away from qualifying on pole before contact with the barriers saw him starting 3rd, Perez only managed a P5 on Saturday. A lockup on lap 1 saw Perez barely avoid taking out his teammate. Perez would lose a position to Leclerc, dropping him to 5th before a safety car on lap 10 resulted in a red flag a few laps later. Unfortunately for Perez, Red Bull would pit him under safety car before the red flag came out, dropping him down to 8th when the race started again on lap 15. But it wouldn't matter anyway, as Perez's day would end when he was squeezed between 2 cars before the first lap of green flag racing came to an end. Hamilton would win the race after some on-track shenanigans and sus radio communication between the stewards and Red Bull, but for Perez, he had no impact on the race or championship battle once again. Now we have come to the final race of the season. Another average Saturday for Perez, qualifying P4 behind Verstappen, Hamilton, and Norris. Perez did well enough to move up to P3 almost right away, but by lap 14 was 9.5 seconds behind his teammate in P2. By lap 20, after pitting, Hamilton had caught up to Perez, who hadn't pitted yet, with gap from Verstappen to Hamilton at a little over 6 seconds. Perez did well enough to fight the overtake and keep ahead of Hamilton to allow Verstappen to catch up. By the time Hamilton got by a few laps later, Verstappen had closed the gap to 1.2 seconds, though Hamilton would eventually stretch that gap to about 12 seconds later on in the race. This would later turn out to be a godsend for Verstappen when Latifi went into the wall on lap 53. At this point, Hamilton was only 12 seconds ahead of Verstappen, making a pit stop for Hamilton a tough call. With only 5 laps to go, if Hamilton boxed and fell behind Verstappen, they ran the chance of losing if the safety car went to the end. But if Hamilton stayed out and Verstappen boxed, and the race went back to green flag racing, Hamilton would be eaten alive on his old hard tires. Had Hamilton had those 6 seconds from before Perez held him up, Mercedes could have boxed for new tires and safely come out in front of Verstappen. But because Perez took those 6 seconds away, Hamilton and Mercedes were almost kind of screwed no matter what choice they made. The fate of Mercedes lay in the hands of the race stewards and race director. And unfortunately for Mercedes, it didn't go their way. There would be 1 lap of green flag racing and, well, you know what happened. So there we have it, every single race from the 2021 season. After that breakdown, what do you think of Perez's role in Verstappen winning the championship? For our part, we think it's a bit of a wash. There were 2 or 3 races where he was close enough to be able to help Verstappen, but there were also 2 or 3 races where his actions actually helped Hamilton. If we look at races like Imola and the second Austrian race, rookie mistakes, overeager attacking, and hard defending that were penalized resulted in dropping way down the grid and allowing Hamilton to finish higher and score more points than he should have. For about 80% of the races, Perez was just too far back to really factor into the race, much less the championship battle. And the remaining 20% of the season was split between helping Verstappen or helping Hamilton. So while he did help Verstappen, in the aggregate, he really did not factor into the overall scheme of things. But we can understand why some fans feel the way they do. On top of personal biases, recency bias also plays a role in their opinions. Abu Dhabi was the season finale, and the explosive way in which the race ended ensured that it would stick in the minds of fans for a long time to come. But honestly, if anyone should be awarded an assist in the final race, it should be Michael Masi. But again, let's not open that can of worms. We don't want to speculate too much, but Verstappen probably would have won no matter who his teammate was in 2021. Other than a few races, Perez rarely ever finished within 20 seconds of his teammate the entire season, so it's difficult for us to accept that Perez really played a major role in helping Verstappen through the entirety of the season, though on the few occasions he did. Again, this is just our opinion, and we want to state that we hold no ill will towards the Mexican driver. He is a solid number 2 driver and seemingly a good fit for Red Bull, but to say that Verstappen wouldn't have won without him is a bit of an overstatement. Anyways, I hope we can have some civil discourse in the comments section. Let us know what you think. What was your opinion before this video, and has our presentation changed it? If you feel like we've earned it, please feel free to leave a like, comment, or subscribe. Stay tuned for more. Remember to eat your bok choy, and we'll see you in the next one.